were from Germany, 12,000 from Ireland, and about 2,000 African Americans in Illinois at the time. But it wasn't always a perfect opportunity for recruiting. People didn't stumble over themselves. There was a request by the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, Joseph Medill, requested of Washington to reduce their requirement for the county in December 1864. And their logic was that they had oversubscribed the one prior, so they shouldn't have to provide that many. And it first went to Secretary of War Stanton, who said no, turn the troops over. It then went to Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln made a comment that I want to read to you because I think it's very interesting and an idea of what was going on. He said at the time, "Gentlemen, after Boston, you have been the chief instrument in bringing this war to the country. The Northwest has opposed the South as the Northeast has opposed the South. It is you who are largely responsible for making blood flow as it has. You called for the war until we had it. You have called for emancipation, and I have given it to you. Whatever you have asked, you have had. Now you come here begging to be let off from the call of men which I have made to carry out the war which you have demanded. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves. I have a right to expect better things. Go home and raise those 6,000 men." He then continued, he said, "Medill, you're a coward. You and your Tribune have had more influence than any other paper in the Northwest in making the war. Go home and send me those men." The men were provided. In fact, the three who were in this group went outside after the discussion, and one of them said to the other, supposedly, "Let's not say another word of this. The old man's right." So that's giving an indication of where things were throughout the Civil War in Illinois. Let's talk about Chicago before we talk about Camp Douglas. The two yellow brackets there are the important ones. You can see the growth of Chicago between 1860 and 1870. It virtually tripled. Chicago at the time was the fastest growing city, some say, in the world. And I submit that the Civil War created the big shoulders that Chicago became known for. For example, the clothing industry went from a little over $2 million in volume to 12 million in 2 years. Pork production increased 600% through 1863. And shoes and boots went from 2.5 million to 14.5 million. Just gives you a rough idea of how huge the war was to Chicago. But let's look at Camp Douglas. First of all, where was Camp Douglas? Camp Douglas was located, the northern boundary was 31st Street in Chicago, which at the time was the city limits. The city limits did not go to 35th Street until 1863, so it started out outside the city. The eastern boundary was Cottage Grove Avenue, and Cottage Grove was a hard service macadam surface road that actually went from downtown Chicago to the village of Hyde Park. It also had an omnibus on it, and I'll talk a little more about the omnibus as it related to Camp Douglas in a minute. The southern boundary was roughly 33rd Place, and the western boundary, Giles Avenue. And here today in the center, you can see where King Drive is. One of the interesting things about the camp was this little bite out of it. Uh, you might wonder what the bite is all about. Why do we have that bite out of there? Well, the camp, which was named after Senator Stephen Douglas, although it was not his land that provided most of it, much of it was by Henry Graves, whose home was here. As a matter of fact, his home is how Cottage Grove got its name. His house was known as the Cottage in the Grove. Well, his wife refused to leave. The camp was built around them. And I've often said, one of these days, I'm going to have an opportunity to talk to people from the Civil War. There are two people I want to talk to. One is Abraham Lincoln, and the second one is Mrs. Graves. I'd like to know how she enjoyed her time with roughly 70,000 soldiers in her backyard, untold number of horses, and virtually no uh, sanitation. I'm not sure she found it terribly exciting. Here's what Camp Douglas looks like, superimposed on a modern Google map. This is Lakeshore Drive, obviously Lake Michigan. This is the Illinois Central Railroad, which was really central to um, having um, the camp located where it was because of the transportation. This property now, the area roughly in this area is all controlled by one major real estate firm, Draper and Kramer. I have said it to them and I've said it publicly a number of times. Draper and Kramer has done nothing for us. They are not the best neighbor to have. When we first talked to them about Camp Douglas and trying to do something to remember the camp, their response was, "We don't care what you do and don't ever call us again." But otherwise, they're really nice folks. The camp, over the period of time it was operated, was improved from time to time with additional water that was provided by the city of Chicago. And finally, a sewer was run basically along here to take the waste from the camp. And of course, it went directly into Lake Michigan. And Lake Michigan, incidentally, was up to and equal to the railroad at the time. So this is all landfill. Just to, I think I was wrong, to take a, oops, let me get it right here. To give an idea of why the camp was where it is, uh, typical of Illinois, I guess, the selection was made not by a member of the military, but by a politician. Governor Yates decided he needed 3 induction centers for Union soldiers who were entering into the Union Army, a north, central, and south sections. Camp Douglas was selected to cover the north section, which basically covered from the southern boundary of Cook County to the Wisconsin line, from Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. Any soldier entering into the Army from that location was inducted or processed at Camp Douglas. Um, why was it ultimately selected as a prison? Which is another question that is interesting. Um, the idea of having prisons, there were 3 criteria established for Union prisons. One, they wanted them far enough away from the fighting that there couldn't be raids to release prisoners. Secondly, you needed to be on good transportation lines away from the fighting with the river system and the Illinois Central Railroad at Cairo. Uh, Camp Douglas was a logical location. And finally, they wanted it near enough to a major metropolitan area to provide for uh, solid logistics support. The camp consisted of 4 distinct areas. This area, called Garrison Square, was, as the name implied, it's where the garrison was held. This was the headquarters building here. Um, this was mostly the permanent troops who were at the camp, although some of the mustering in units were there as well. This area is called White Oak Square. White Oak Square was also housing for Union soldiers. Ironically, when the first prisoners arrived, they stayed in that area as well, and actually shared barracks with their guards, which must have made for some interesting times. This area, called South Square, sometimes called Hospital Square, was really administrative areas. This was a hospital. In there was a hospital for the prisoners and a hospital for the Union soldiers, also their sawmill and other logistics areas. This area, called Prisoners Square, originally was configured similar to Garrison Square with the rectangle around the outside. In early 1864, they decided, and as a matter of fact, it was Colonel Sweet who led this, to construct barracks there for the sole purpose of housing the prisoners. And as a result, the periphery of that became a 12 to 14 foot stockade fence with lighting to protect the population from the prisoners. A little bit about the history of the camp. The camp opened as a reception center for Union soldiers in September 1861. In February 1862, the first prisoners arrived. These prisoners arrived from Fort Donelson, where about 12,000 soldiers, Confederate soldiers, surrendered to General Grant. A majority of them came to Camp Douglas, although others went to a few other prisons in the area. There was a prison in Springfield, Camp Morton. There was a camp in Camp Butler. Camp Butler. I'm sorry. Camp Morton was in Indianapolis, and those were the three areas where most of the prisoners went. We'll talk more about that in a bit. It operated continuously as a prison camp and also as a mustering in center for lesser units until December 1865. A majority of the prisoners left there in July of 1865 after the war, and it took until December for them to discommission the camp. And by December 1865, the camp was gone. All the buildings were gone, everything. Nothing remained after December 1865. Here's a quick picture of this is of Prisoners Square and prisoners probably in about 1864 sometime. These are some prisoners from early days. This was in 1862. These are believed to be prisoners from Fort Donelson. The interesting thing about this photograph is the top coats these soldiers are wearing are Union top coats. Can't tell from the color here, but they are actually blue. And you can tell from the button configuration they were issued to the Union soldiers. One of the complaints about Camp Douglas and other prison camps was that they rarely, if ever, provided any clothing to protect the prisoners. Well, here are 5 who got some clothing. I guess the cynic can say they probably gave them that clothes so they could take a picture and took it away from them. Don't know the answer to that, but at least here are 5 who got nice warm topcoats. This is another group, Morgan's Raiders, who arrived in Camp Douglas in 1863. They're my favorite group of prisoners, and we'll talk a lot more about it a little bit later. Let's talk just about some plain old ordinary facts, get them out of the way, and then we can talk about some more fun stuff. The camp was about 60 acres in size. Actually, there were sub-camps outside the camp, particularly in the early days when they were recruiting Union soldiers, because 60 acres couldn't hold all of them. But the camp that I outlined was roughly 60 acres, contained about 200 buildings, 66 of which were those prison barracks. And those 200 buildings were gone by 1865. Now, except for the camp headquarters building, none of the buildings were built on foundations. They were merely wooden buildings built on the surface. In fact, the prisoners' barracks were actually built on pillars about 3 feet high to keep the prisoners from digging out from under without being seen. Union troops trained there were nearly 40,000. A vast majority of those troops were trained between 1861, when it opened, and the end of 1862. After that, the recruiting by regimental size of about 1,000 soldiers was fairly significantly reduced. And most of the Union troops who came in to be trained from that point were soldiers who were going to be replacements for units. So they came through in small units or individually, and then immediately out to the front where they were trained. Really, most of their training was done by the unit they were going to. It was one of 8 Union camps to train African American soldiers. And while the Illinois African American units actually mustered in Quincy, those African Americans who were from Chicago or from the northern area came through Camp Douglas fairly briefly on their way to Peoria, but they were received and trained there. It was one of the longest operating prisons in the Civil War. A total of about 30,000 prisoners were held there over the course of that period. 12,000, a little over 12,000 was the most held at any one time. And that number is the number that most people use when they're trying to compare sizes. That 12,000 number came from muster calls when periodically the commander of the camp will say, put them all on the street and let's count them. And that was a much more precise figure. The 30,000, the total number, is a little difficult because if a prisoner escaped and was captured, was that a new prisoner? Was it an old prisoner? So you can see it was some confusion, but it was still a very, very large prison. Interestingly, when 12,000 were held there, it was rated for about 9,000. And 9,000 was 2 prisoners per bunk in the barracks. You can do the math to figure out how many were sleeping together when it was 12,000. Unfortunately, had the greatest number of prisoners' deaths in Union prisons. It didn't have the highest death rate. That distinction went to Elmira, New York. The death rate at Camp Douglas was about 15%. But in terms of numbers, it had the largest number. Documented prison deaths due to disease were about 4,000 of 70,000 treated. Total deaths are estimated somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000. That number is very difficult to determine. The record keeping by the mortician who took them out of the camp initially, when they were buried in City Cemetery in the north side of Chicago. They had 2 different numbers. When they were disinterred, there was a 3rd number. And when they arrived at their ultimate place, we'll talk about in a minute, nobody cared how many were there. But the death total was between 5 and 6. A vast majority of the deaths were from disease. Documented deaths caused by guards shooting people, I can only document about 25 because disease certainly took an opportunity to get rid of many of the prisoners. Why were so many lives lost? Well, first of all, there was no history for prison reincarnation during the prior to the Civil War. Incarceration was really unheard of. Prisoners prior to the American Civil War were either immediately killed, placed into slavery, ransomed if they were wealthy enough, or were paroled. The concept of paroling the prisoners, where they would sign an agreement not to fight until they were duly exchanged for a soldier of the other side, was the primary way of handling prisoners. This was done for very practical reasons. Mobile armies in these days and prior to these days didn't have the logistic support. They didn't have the men or the opportunity or the time to handle prisoners. They needed to get them out of their hair, and parole was the easiest way. That changed in the American Civil War because of some changes in technology. One, the development of railroads, and in the United States, the improvement of water transportation allowed the field commander to get rid of their prisoners rather than parole them and have them someone else's problem. One of the other major reasons for loss of life was a poor training on the part of the leadership, the guards, and even the prisoners. Leadership at Camp Douglas, particularly in the early days, would be a colonel who was a commander of a unit being mustered in there. And they would go to that colonel and say, "Colonel, you're mustering in a unit. You're now in command of the prisoners." And that was about all. Now that commander, that colonel, wanted to get his unit mustered in and get the heck to the war, really didn't want to be around the prisoners, and had no training to do that. The guards was the same thing. Early on, the guards were actually received from individual units mustering in, which meant that the guard may have had absolutely no training in even firing his weapon. That changed really in 1863 when the Veteran Reserve Corps began, the Invalid Corps began doing some of the guarding. But even those guards were poorly trained. The prisoners themselves, soldiers were never taught how to behave as a prisoner. That was not one of the priorities of 18th century military training. It was how to move, and how to shoot. Virtually nothing else. The next was a lack of preparation for long-term incarceration. Once they had realized they were going to hold prisoners, the concept was that the prisoners will be held for no more than 10 days. Under the Dix Hill Cartel, which was an agreement between the Confederacy and the Union on how to exchange prisoners who were paroled, stated clearly in that document, you will exchange prisoners within 10 days of capture. Well, that worked if you were going to move them directly from the battle site to a place to exchange them. Once they started going to prisons, that 10 days was out of the question. Unfortunately, neither the Union nor the Confederacy did any preparation when it suddenly realized they were going to hold these prisoners for more than 10 days. In addition, in mid-1863, President Lincoln terminated the exchange of prisoners. He suspended that exchange because Jefferson Davis refused to accept African-American soldiers as captured soldiers. He rather was going to treat them as escaped slaves. He also said that any white officers commanding the colored troops, as they were known in those days, would be immediately summarily killed. There's no record of any the officers being killed, but there certainly was record of soldiers being placed back into slavery. So Lincoln terminated in 1863, which meant long-term incarceration was now basically until the war was over. Another problem with the loss of life at Camp Douglas was high leadership turnover. There were 9 commanders of the camp in the 3.5 years it was in existence, with 12 command changes. A couple of them served twice. And that doesn't count 3 times when young captains were responsible for the camp when there were very few prisoners there. There were 2 exchanges of prisoners, one in mid-1862 and one in mid-1863, at which time there were virtually no prisoners there. But the turnover, by the time a commander realized what was needed in the camp, he was gone. And the camp overall controlled by a Colonel Hoffman, who was a commissary of prisoners, and General Meigs, the quartermaster general of the U.S. Army, used that they're not going to be there very long for an excuse not to make improvements. And by the time a commander realized what he needed to improve the camp, he was probably gone. Another cause of loss of life was lack of natural immunity due to the rural environment of the Confederate soldier. Childhood diseases we know of today, measles, for example, and mumps, were a significant cause of illness in the camps, just because these rural dwelling soldiers had not been in locations with large groups of people. The other condition of the prisoners when they arrived and their diet change. The diet change was interesting because the Southern soldier was basically corn and pork. He got to the North and was suddenly fed bread and beef. The change in diet had certainly had an impact on him. The condition of the prisoners was also a major factor. Give you an example, at Fort Donelson, when it surrendered on the 15th of February. General Grant said to those captives, you can take anything you have on you except your weapon. I'm going to give you 2 days rations and get on that boat. And they were put on river boats, went up the Cumberland River to the Ohio River, ultimately to primarily to Cairo or Paducah, Kentucky. Some went to St. Louis who were injured. Put on at Cairo, they were put on the Illinois Central Railroad, unheated as the boats were unheated, and sent to Camp Douglas. The first troops arrived at Camp Douglas on the 22nd of February, a little more than 2 days. The temperature at that time in Chicago was roughly 25 degrees for that day. Another example, at the end of the war, at the Battle of Franklin in 1864, those prisoners were captured in Franklin, Tennessee, were marched to Nashville, about 20 miles. Oh, and by the way, they had walked from Atlanta. They were then put on a train to Louisville, and from Louisville to Camp Douglas. Many prisoners in diaries and journals commented that you could tell the prisoner's path from Franklin to Nashville by the bloody footprints. Most did not have shoes. When they got to Chicago, they stood for more than a half a day in snow before they were processed. So you can imagine the condition these prisoners were in when they got to prison camps. And finally, an inadequate and primitive medical care. The whole germ theory of germs was 25 years away. So primitive medical care had a great impact on it. This is a busy slide. I just want to show it to you briefly, which shows those 4,000 deaths and the causes. And you'll notice many of those are either from sanitation or they're from disease that are such as smallpox and fever and so forth. one of the interesting stories of smallpox could be prevented with the smallpox vaccination. And there's many stories, and we'll tell you one in a minute, about why the smallpox vaccination wasn't very successful. You'll notice the 70,000, and I said there were roughly 20,000, 30,000 prisoners. So obviously prisoners were there more than once. The one interesting one is scurvy. And you look at it and say, well, only 39 died, not a big deal, and 3,700 were ill. I would submit that those 3,700 likely came back again because of the way scurvy tears down the body. And the unfortunate thing about that, scurvy could have been prevented. For some reason, Colonel Hoffman refused to allow the settlers or the sellers, people who sold stuff to the soldiers, to sell fruits and vegetables. And for some reason, the camp commanders did not use their camp funds to buy vegetables and fruits which are readily available. So why that happened, I don't know. What happened to those prisoners? I mentioned they were originally buried in City Cemetery, which is now the southern end of Lincoln Park. In 1864, when they were closing, 1867, when they were closing City Cemetery, they were moved to Oakwood Cemetery at 67th and Cottage Grove. Why were they moved to Oakwoods? Well, basically they were moved to Oakwoods because nobody else would have them. All the other major cemeteries refused to allow the Confederate soldiers to be buried in their cemeteries. I found record of one soldier who was buried elsewhere, and that was a Jewish soldier who was buried in the Jewish section, moved to the Jewish section of City Cemetery. Unfortunately, his remains were subsequently lost. Estimated up to 6,000 soldiers are buried there. There were 4,243 identified by name by the brass plates around the base of the monument. The monument was dedicated in 1865, and it is now a federal monument, and the Confederate mound is a federal burial ground. There are more Confederates buried there in Chicago than anywhere north of the Mason-Dixon line. And Oakwood Cemetery Confederate mound is known as the largest mass grave in the Western Hemisphere. What do we know about Camp Douglas? How do we know it? Well, here's some examples of it. You can see a couple of photographs, some etchings, and a number of maps which have allowed us to get a pretty good idea of what the camp was like. As I mentioned, it was originally a camp for Union soldiers. Therefore, it was in relatively good condition. It was not kept up as well as it should have been. And when they realized they were going to have to hold prisoners for an undetermined time, improvements were made. But, pardon me. But they were too little, too late. But I like to talk about people, and let's talk about some people who were at Camp Douglas. One is Morgan's Raiders. Now, this was a group that I particularly liked, and you look at them, they look like a real hardy bunch. There were somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 of them at Camp Douglas. They were captured in 1863, arriving in August of 1863. Ironically, just as Lincoln was suspending the exchange of prisoners. So these prisoners realized there were only a few ways out of the camp. You could die, you could sign the oath of allegiance, the war would be over, or you could escape. Well, they didn't want to die. They refused to sign the oath of allegiance. The war sure didn't look like it was going to end. So they decided it was time to escape. And these guys did everything they could to escape. They drove the guards absolutely crazy. Um, they were thick as thieves, so to speak. They took care of each other. Uh, Very rarely would they allow one of their own to starve. That just didn't happen there. They also had their own band. They also had a minstrel show, and they published a newspaper shown there on the right, the Vedette in March of 1864. Unfortunately, that's the only copy that is available uh, that remains, and unfortunately, it hung in the Sun in the old Chicago Public Library, main library, and was all the first half of it was destroyed by the Sun. But these guys were particularly special, and I think they were special. I did a quick, very unscientific analysis of their death rate, and I believe the death rate of Morgan's raiders was somewhere between 5 to 7%, compared to 15% for the general population. And much of that, I think, can be attributed to the way they behaved themselves. Fast forward to 1955 and the Code of Conduct for the US military, and I just want to read part of what it says. It said, "You will use all means to resist. It's your duty to escape, to seek or accept favors. You will never accept parole. You will keep faith in your fellow prisoners and maintain the chain of command." Interesting, in 1955, when they wrote that, when it was published for the US Army, was everything Morgan's Raiders did at Camp Douglas. But let's talk about a few other uh, little known deeds and doers, just to give you an idea. One, Robert Anderson Bagby was a prisoner from 1863 to 1865. Bagby was a nurse in the prison hospital during most of that time. So he had a different perspective on what took place in the hospitals. And let me read from one of his diary entries. This was February 11th, 1863. "Most of the deaths were from pneumonia. It was enough to discourage the most considerate man to see so many deaths. To know the undertaker was taking from 12 to 20 dead loads each day from the camp." But he goes on to say, "This never shook my faith, and I remained in good spirits and good health." Bagby also commented about, I mentioned signing the oath of allegiance, which is one way to get out of a prison. In the case of the Confederate soldier, if you were from an area controlled by the Union, such as the border states and places like Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, you could go home, sign the oath of allegiance, you go home. Otherwise, many of the soldiers joined the military. Most of them joined the Navy, so they wouldn't have to meet their buddies. But here's what Bagby, who was from Missouri, was captured in Arkansas, could have signed the oath of allegiance and gone home anytime during his stay. Here's what he said. "There was some recruiting in the camp." This was February 27th, 1864. "Some recruiting in the camp about taking the oath. A good many were taking it. I disagree myself. Taking the oath was a disgrace. Although I was doing all right, taking the oath was more than I could stand. How could I stay at home after taking the oath? How could they have confidence in a man who would take the oath? They could not." Interesting perspective from a Confederate soldier. James Blanchard is a good, fun candidate. Also, the guards hated Blanchard. In March of 1863, he was caught slipping by the sentries. In April, he escaped over the fence. He was caught in downtown Chicago, got on that omnibus, went downtown Chicago, got a snoot full of liquor, which was not unusual for escaped prisoners, was in a tavern, rather raggedy looking, raggedly clothed, probably had a Southern accent, and wondered why he was arrested as an escaped prisoner. But he was brought back. In May, he bribed his way out and got caught. Later, he tried to tunnel his way out. Finally, he was exchanged, and I think the guards were very happy to see Mr. Blanchard leave. But an example of the kind of thing that these prisoners did, they'd do anything to get out of that. This is John Miller's interesting story. He was a saloon keeper in Chicago and went broke. Left Chicago, went south, joined the Confederate Army, was captured, was sent to Camp Douglas. Unfortunately, his creditors realized where he was, and they used to come frequently to Camp Douglas to harass Mr. Miller. I don't know if they ever got their money back, but they sure enjoyed coming to Camp Douglas and picking on poor John Miller. The young man and his mother, sweet story. Early 1862, the young man went south to make his way, a young teenager, joined the Confederate Army, was captured, was sent to Camp Douglas. His mother found out he was there, and this is what she supposedly said to him when she was able to meet with him. "Oh, dear boy, you have been the subject of many prayers, and you are not past praying for yet." The camp authorities released the young man to his mother's custody. Lieutenant Fife's dog. This is a story that a number of prisoners tell this story. No one takes credit for it. Lieutenant Fife was an officer of the guard and had a little terrier that ran around. Everybody liked him. Well, one day the terrier came up missing. So Lieutenant Fife wrote a little note on the bulletin board in the camp prison compound and said, $10 reward for the return of my dog. He went back a few days later, and under this offer of $10 was a poem, apparently written by a prisoner, and the poem was as follows: "For the want of meat, the dog is eat. For the want of bread, the dog is dead." As I say, many prisoners told that story, but none of them admitted they knew anything about it. William Huff, I want to read just one quick thing from Huff because I think it puts prisons and prisoners of war in an interesting perspective. This was an entry in his diary on April 15th, 1865. I think you all know what April 15th was. Here's what he wrote. "Today, everything is astir, for it is stated that Lincoln is assassinated. I believe it, for the Yankees assert it. Their actions prove it. They are mad today and are doing all sorts of things to the boys, knocking them, beating them, and several are in the dungeon for saying that they were glad of it. I am almost afraid to say anything, for they are too much enraged." Can you imagine being a prisoner when Lincoln was killed? John Copley was one of the other diarists that I had the opportunity to read his diaries. He was a marvelous writer. I just absolutely loved reading his work. There were some guards that were hated there, just absolutely despised, and were identified by more than one prisoner as these 5 guards who were really, really brutal. Well, Copley described one of them. The guard was old Red O'Hara, and Red O'Hara, incidentally, later was killed in a knife fight in downtown Chicago. But here's what Copley said about old Red O'Hara. "The large, ill-shaped nose and 2 dull gray eyes placed in the midst of a pair of unsightly cheeks gives to his countenance a most hideous and semi-comic appearance and expression. 2 ponderous ears stood out in bold relief, one on each side of his head. somewhat resembling the side lamps of a carriage. Interesting description. There was another soldier there who was a soldier of the guard, Captain Spoonable, Lieutenant Fife's boss. And here's how Copley described him. He was of medium stature, figure grotesque and ugly in the extreme. Features were coarse. Face resembled a well-grown artichoke, covered over as it was with large bumps. Hair stood straight up when it was not saturated with grease or oil. Again, a pretty good description of somebody obviously he didn't like very well. These are just some stories that I found interesting from some of the prisoners at Camp Douglas. A little bit about what the Restoration Foundation is doing. One of the major things we do is archaeological investigations. Our first one was done in June of 2012. We then have completed them virtually every year for 2019 when the pandemic got us. They've been conducted in cooperation with DePaul University, Loyola, Marquette University, Northern Michigan, the Kenosha Civil War Museum were primary people who have supported it. They've been managed by a Dr. Scott Dimmel, and the latter one's by Dr. Michael Gregory. Dr. Gregory is formerly on the staff of DePaul University and is now a board member of the Camp Douglas Restoration Foundation and running all of our archaeological work. Was funded initially by the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation, and it's also funded by a private company, Clark Roofing, in Broadview, Illinois. And believe me, when you're doing archaeological work, it's nice to have a pickup truck, fencing, and plywood. And Clark Roofing has been more than gracious to provide funding for all of that in all of our digs. What were our goals? We wanted to confirm the camp's location. There has been some question of where exactly it was, what the boundaries were. We wanted to obtain period artifacts, and we wanted to obtain other historic information on the community. And we, through this, wanted to increase awareness. If we were a member of the Cubs or the White Sox, we'd be in the Hall of Fame because we fortunately have met all four of those objectives. Here on the camp is where we've dug. The yellow ones show the ones we have dug. We've actually dug. The pink circles are where we are hoping to dig in the future once we are done with this pandemic. One of the interesting ones was this one in here, which is at a private residence. This was a public park, and this was a schoolyard. So we've done a number of different places. Here's a typical one. This was the first one we did, and you can see what it looked like. Interesting character here is another one of our now directors. You may know of him, Dr. Ted Karamansky, Loyola University. He spent a week in 90-degree temperature digging with his students. This is one of the major finds, and that rock that's marked there, we believe is the headquarters foundation, the foundation of the headquarters building. We're pretty sure that's what it is based on where it was quarried, where it was located, and the tool marks on it. We think pretty well proved that it was that. Here's an example of where we are in the schoolyard. Mike Gregory on the left of that is the archaeologist. We've had about 300 people dig with us over the course of time, many of them students, but not necessarily. They can be anybody. This gentleman, for example, was a tour bus driver in Chicago and wanted to dig. And he said, anybody who wants to dig, send me an email and we'll let you know when we're going to do it again. You're always welcome. One of our highlights is working with the kids. Here we did a mock dig with the third grade students at the John J. Pershing Magnet School. Here we had them actually out on the archaeological dig screening and talking to one of our supervisors about the dig. What do we find? Lots of stuff. The gun is cool. Well, I tell you, the kids loved that because that was in the schoolyard. Unfortunately, when we got it cleaned up, it was two pieces of tin. In the old days, you might have seen the old tin toys that were stuck together and riveted. That's what it was. It was a toy. The one on the upper right is the original Pounds Vaseline. One of the first military items we found was this bead. It's a cap badge that the Union wore on their kepi. We discovered it in 2014. It was probably issued in 1863. It was really the first military artifacts we found. Subsequently, we found a number of military buttons. We found rubber blanket grommets. These were, both sides had rubber blankets that they used. We found 58 caliber mini balls. We found a number of those. We also found, these were unfired incidentally. We also found them among glass fragments, which was important to us because it identified where we had some buildings we weren't sure there were buildings. Other things, earthenware that was used, the Prosser buttons were underwear buttons, nails, glass, and mirror glass that came from the camp itself. The latest and most important item we have is this block-eye button. This is one we can confirm was manufactured in the Confederacy and was found on Camp Douglas. So we know at least there was one piece of artifacts from the Confederacy. But let me talk a little bit about Benjamin Sweet. As I say, you guys have more to do with Sweet than anyone. He was a very interesting man. And I think Allison made the comment when we talked earlier, he's also handsome. So I'll just pass that on. But I know you probably know this, but for my benefit, let me summarize his background. He was a member of the Wisconsin legislature, actually came to Wisconsin, was an attorney. He served in both the 6th and the 21st Wisconsin Infantry. The 6th was kind of interesting. That's one of the Iron Brigade. And Colonel Sweet had a different side too. He had some very strong disagreements with his commander of the 6th and ultimately resigned from that command and later joined the 21st Wisconsin. So he's not without some little bit of controversy. He was wounded in Perryville, Kentucky in October of 1862, spent much of that follow-up period in convalescing. He joined the Invalid Corps, which later became the Veteran Reserve Corps, in September of 1863 when he joined Camp Douglas. This was a time that, when I spelled Camp Douglas for the other Douglas. I guess that's just I put an extra S in there for Frederick Douglass, I guess. But the Veteran Reserve Corps really stabilized the management of Union prisons. They really provided continuity for both the guards and the commanders. It was good and bad for the guards. Those guards that I quoted, what Copley said, were Veteran Reserve Corps people. The bad part of those guards is if they were going to do terrible things, they had a lot of time to do it. But that's when he first came to Camp Douglas. He commanded Camp Douglas longer than any other commander, from May 2nd, 1864 until October 1st, 1865. And as I mentioned, by July, the camp prisoners were pretty well gone. But he was by far the longest serving commander. And I think at Camp Douglas, he would have to be considered probably the most professional of the commanders. Among other things, I think Colonel Sweet wanted to get his star as a general at Camp Douglas. He did receive a brevet brigadier general designation, but it was never confirmed. So he was officially a colonel with a brevet general. He felt he could get that general's star permanently by being the commander at Camp Douglas. There were two other generals who commanded Camp Douglas. Both of them received their general stars in combat. But what were some of the things he did? He shared pretty much the day-to-day command with the Colonel James Strong. In fact, both Colonel Strong and Colonel Sweet did not live on the camp until they were ordered to do so. They lived downtown. They were in early 1864 ordered to stay at Camp Douglas, and they both did. Colonel Strong really did a lot of the day-to-day stuff, worried about the guards and so forth. And Colonel Sweet was much more interested in the overall condition of the prisoners and the guards. He was known as a stern disciplinarian. That was a double-edged sword. I mean, I think many of the prisoners respected him for that. Give an example of his disciplinary sternness. At one point, near the end of the war, he wrote an order to the prisoners and basically saying, you know, you have a right to escape. And if I catch you, I have a right to punish you. Now, if I catch you, I'm going to punish you, but I'm not going to punish you unfairly. But realize if we catch you on the way of escaping, we may kill you. But it's your responsibility to do so. I thought a real professional way of approaching it with the prisoners. The one thing he did probably more than anyone else, and probably saved more lives than any commander at Camp Douglas, and perhaps I've had the good fortune of looking at a lot of prison camps throughout the United States. And I would say General Sweet, probably more than any other commander, save one or two, emphasized personal hygiene. He required the soldiers to bathe at least once a week. He required that their barracks be swept daily and cleaned once a week. And he was a stickler on this. If they weren't showing the proper personal hygiene, many of them got a bath with a real hard scrub brush. So personal hygiene probably saved an incredible number of lives. He was, as I say, he was fair and generally respected. No one loved the commander. And if they did things to break the rules, they knew they were going to be punished. And the punishment that was dealt out by Colonel Sweet was punishment, the same punishment that Union soldiers received when they were breaking the rules. There was the mule they would ride, which is a sawhorse on steroids, about 14 feet high, that used to get to straddle for an hour or so. Or they would had to stand on a barrel or wear signs, be hung up by their thumbs. These were typical punishment of prisoners, whether you were in the Union or were prisoners. As I say, he certainly respected the prisoners, and I think that was one of the things that made him strong. One of the interesting things about him was the conspiracy of 1864. This was a conspiracy that some think was mostly in his mind. Some think was carried out by some of the Confederates. And true, for the Democratic Convention that was scheduled in the summer of 1864, a number of Confederate spies and hangers-on came here to perhaps try to break out some prisoners from Camp Douglas. Turned out they couldn't rally enough support from the sympathizers in Chicago to do this, so they gave up. They then decided to come back at the election of 1864 in November to do the same thing. Colonel Sweet had a spy from the camp, a guy by the name of Shanks, who infiltrated the Confederates who were here and turned them all in. The only problem with that story is Shanks was well known as a bad guy to the conspirators. I doubt if they would have given him the time of day. They knew he was a bad guy. The other thing I found interesting, diaries of Morgan's raiders, who would have been primary people to help break out of Camp Douglas, there was nowhere in their journals or diaries where they said this was something that was a major interest. So whether it was a true conspiracy or not, Colonel Sweet thought it was, resulted in a trial in Cincinnati, at which one prisoner was sentenced to death, several were sentenced to some long-term prison sentences, and the wife of one of the former mayors of the city was banished to Kentucky. But that was Colonel Sweet, I think an incredible man, and you know more about what he did after that, along with his daughter in the women's suffrage activity, just really wonderful. If you're interested in any more of Camp Douglas, here are a couple of books, Story of Camp Douglas, which I happen to write, and also annotated Robert Anderson Bagby's diary. Those are available on our website if you're of interest. A couple of others, I have a new book coming out in May on all prison camps during the Civil War, a study based on a study I did for the National Park Service. And if you're just interested in the Civil War in Chicago, I strongly recommend Ted Karamansky's book, Rally Round the Flag. It is a truly outstanding book to give you the history of the Civil War. There's nothing there except this marker. And we'll open up. I ran a little long, but I hope you don't mind, and ready for questions.
Well, thank you, David. That was great. I learned a lot. I knew some of that, but not all of that. Yes.
Oh, there we see who's here.
Thank you. Yes, great. We have a great turnout tonight for a Wednesday evening. It's so good to have so many people come tonight. In the chat, I did post about how to donate to the Camp Kane Foundation, Camp Douglas Foundation, sorry, Little St. Charles, another camp, different story. The Camp Douglas Foundation is in the chat, and then also to our next program, which is about all citizens, and we do touch a little bit more on Benjamin Sweet and his ties to Lombard, specifically all of his involvement with the word all citizens in the charter for the community of Lombard. And really,
now that I can see some of the names on the screen, I want to acknowledge two people I can see there. Andrew Leck and Mike Greger are both members of our board of directors. I mentioned Mike is an archaeologist who's doing our archaeological work. Andrew is doing a tremendous amount of work on our hope of developing a museum on the site. And I want to thank them both for joining.
Well, we should talk sometime about maybe hosting an exhibit at LHS. And, in the meantime, while you guys, we could always do something at LHS, which would be really great because of the connection with Colonel Sweet. And it's a great story, and it's I think a lot of people don't know about it. So there was one question in the chat earlier about that Carol asked, I heard that immigrants were promised an incentive to enlist. Can you speak to that?
Well, there were incentives to enlist generally. Actually, amounts, oftentimes the state would offer something, $200, $300. The city might offer some more. And social organizations might. I don't know of too many instances of that. The real pressure for the immigrants was recruiting by members of their group, the German regiments, the Irish regiments. This was the pressure that was placed on most of the immigrants, plus the financial, but it was mostly a social pressure.
there was another question about specifically where Colonel Sweet property was. Sorry, gotta love zooming at home.
Mom,
Hey, go into the room. Go, okay, go into the room. Sorry. Great. A question where Colonel Sweet's home was. His home actually was located where the post office is.
Mom.
Gotta love evenings with a 4.5-year-old. So Colonel Sweet's home is actually where the U.S. Post Office is in Lombard, right off of St. Charles, right across the street from the Sheldon Peck Homestead. And so we do talk a bit more about that in the documentary, All Citizens. And actually, we might be putting together a post about some of this. So I hope that answered your question. And happy to answer that. You're welcome, John. Are there any more questions? Well, I think those are all of our questions. David,
Well,
this is
again,
great.
I want to thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it. I hope it was meaningful. And maybe someday, are you going to do the thing in the summer where you had the encampment?
No,